F.M. Alexander repeatedly mentions a certain defect that he saw in nearly all of his pupils when they started, which is that their intrathoracic capacity was diminished and closer to its minimum than its maximum. Today, we will examine what exactly that means. I'll start with a quote from Alexander's first book. He writes, "A proper psychophysical examination would have revealed bad habits in his waking and sleeping moments, which tended more or less to reduce his intrathoracic capacity to a minimum. Such a minimum is not only harmfully inadequate, but also renders due functioning of the vital organs practically impossible. Your thoracic capacity is just the overall volume of your thorax. We can recall that the thorax is more or less your ribcage and its contents. So when Alexander says the capacity is closer to its minimum, he means that the ribcage is smaller than it could be. One might assume that the ribcage, being a bony structure, is of a fixed size, but that is not the case. If we contort or otherwise misplace our ribcage, we apply forces to the ribcage that move the relative position of the ribs in a way that decreases the volume of the thorax." Alexander says intrathoracic capacity because he's talking about the internal volume of the thorax and not the muscles on the outside of the ribcage. It's quite possible for someone to increase the size of their chest by building their muscles, but have no change in their intrathoracic capacity, or even have their intrathoracic capacity become smaller. Alexander connects this problem with the problem of spinal curvature. He writes, "The important factors in relation to spinal curvature are these: A, the bent or curved and therefore shortened spine, and B, the decreased internal capacity of the thoracic cavity," and later adds, "A little consideration will show that any alteration in the spine must necessarily affect the position and working of the ribs." Our ribcage is supposed to be oriented in a certain way, but when our spine is bent and out of place, the relative position and shape of the ribcage are changed, and the ribs themselves will be moved vertically closer to each other, essentially being squashed together. People with a bent spine will tend to maintain their sternum lower than it should be. Your upper ribs are attached to the sternum, so if your sternum is out of place, the ribs must adapt to that. The lower ribs attach to the lumbar spine, so if your lumbar spine is very far forward, as is the case in people with a bent spine, your ribs will also have to adapt to that. Your ribs will adapt to these misdirected forces by moving closer together. When someone is arching their back like this and pulling their sternum back and down, they are essentially caving in the front and back of their ribcage. We would optimally like to be expanding our ribcage, but these habitual misdirected forces that people are applying to their torso are crunching the ribcage. That leads to a significant loss in volume, measured both front to back and from top to bottom. Alexander was vehemently against the deep breathing exercises of his time, which he saw as seriously harmful. He noted that children who were taught these breathing exercises routinely ended up with deformed bodies and terrible habits of breathing. Often, the students would be encouraged to push their ribcage forward and throw their head back to breathe, which was only exaggerating their postural problems. Though their chests may appear abnormally large, their intrathoracic capacity is severely diminished, and their health is harmed by trying to breathe in this manner. Alexander listed a number of defects that resulted from those breathing exercises, including that parts of the chest are unduly expanded, while others that should share in the expansion are contracted, particularly the back in the lumbar region. If you keep your back hollowed out, you are going to lose out on a lot of expansion that is possible to have at your back. When your lower back is so far forward, you are in fact narrowing your back. But that narrowing at the back will actually cause the lower ribs at the front to be pulled apart. Because the widening at the front is only gained through narrowing in the back, it won't increase your intrathoracic capacity. It will also tend to narrow the top end of the thorax, where the lungs and heart are situated, in exchange for widening at the lower front end, where there is no benefit. You'll only be encouraging your abdomen and viscera to spill forward. This undue widening at the lower front end of the rib cage will also cause the lower ribs to bunch together. To better understand the harm caused by a decreased thoracic capacity, we can return to the writing of F.M. Alexander. Incidentally, it may be of value to consider what this condition of minimum intrathoracic capacity really means, and to note some of the influences upon the whole organism. For as this thoracic cavity contains many of the vital organs, the whole abdominal viscera is directly or indirectly influenced by its capacity. Minimum thoracic capacity means that the organs within the thorax are harmfully compressed, and that the heart and lungs do not get a proper chance to function adequately. A harmful strain is thrown upon the heart. The lungs are not adequately employed or sufficiently aerated, and the lung tissue deteriorates. This paragraph continues, but I think you get the idea. Our heart, lungs, and vital organs are located in our thoracic cavity. When we bend our spine and keep our ribcage in a contorted, cramped, and diminished state, our vital organs and breathing mechanism are interfered with, and not only will our health suffer in the long run, but our day-to-day functioning can become impaired. Having our intrathoracic capacity closer to its minimum than its maximum is really just a symptom of our general problems of misuse. This decrease in the intrathoracic capacity that we can observe in most people, even those supposedly displaying good posture, is another sign that something is wrong in the common understanding of posture, and the increase in the thoracic capacity that occurs when rational orders are used to expand the torso and unbend the back can help us verify when we're genuinely making improvements. Jean de Massoero notes that to expand the torso and increase the intrathoracic capacity, we can use two instructions that Alexander used in his first training course. Upper torso comes forward and back back. The direction back back means preventing the lower back from habitually moving forward. We instead want the lower back to go back. The direction upper torso comes forward, which Massoero amends to say the upper torso comes forward and up, counters the habit of pulling the top of the sternum back and down. We ultimately want the sternum to be vertically straight. When we use directions like this, we need to consider them together. You don't want to pull your back back in a way that brings your sternum down, and you don't want to lift your upper torso forward and up in a way that hollows your back. Performing individual movements is not how we correct our posture. We need to coordinate multiple movements to actually get expansion. Massoero would also advise us to pull the lower ribs together at the front, as that will help us to widen the back. It will also make lengthening the torso easier to accomplish. If these three movements are performed simultaneously and correctly, you will reorient the ribcage for the better, increase the vertical distance between the ribs, expand the torso generally, and start to bring your intrathoracic capacity away from its minimum and towards its maximum. If you would like more direct help in learning to expand your torso, I recommend lessons in the Initial Alexander technique. In such lessons, which are done one-on-one over Zoom, you will have a teacher who can help you understand how to rationally guide yourself into making the movements needed to expand your torso, and they will also make sure you know when you're succeeding in doing what you've intended to do and when you're not. More information on how to get lessons in the Initial Alexander technique will be in the description. Thanks for joining me again today. Questions and comments are always welcome in the comments section below.